Snowflakes drifted lazily over the rooftops of London, settling on the pavements like delicate lace. Sophie adjusted her wool scarf, her breath visible in the biting air. Edward, her husband of 5 years, walked beside her with his familiar calm stride. To anyone watching, they were the perfect couple, a picture of warmth in the cold. They had met on a rainy afternoon in Cambridge, and ever since, Edward had been her anchor. He was steady, thoughtful, a man who made her tea when she had a cold and always kissed her forehead before leaving for work. Sophie had believed in that love completely. Until the day Amelia Clark returned. The first time Sophie heard Amelia's name was by accident. Edward had been scribbling in his leather-bound journal in the study. When he left the room, the open pages caught Sophie's eye. There, written in Edward's precise handwriting, were lines about a woman with a laugh like summer rain, who had taught him what love could be. The name Amelia appeared again and again. Sophie closed the journal, her heart pounding, telling herself it meant nothing. Days passed, but the distance grew. Edward's eyes often wandered, his phone seemed to vibrate more often, and sometimes he would leave the house claiming urgent meetings. Sophie wanted to believe it was work. But something deep inside whispered otherwise. The turning point came during their winter holiday in Snowdonia. The trip was meant to rekindle their spark, with mist curling over the mountains and the hot springs steaming in the cold air. That evening, as snow began to fall heavily, they sat together in the warmth of the springs, their breaths mingling with the steam. Edward's phone rang. He glanced at the screen and froze. "It's Amelia," he muttered under his breath. Sophie's fingers stiffened in the water. He answered. She could only hear fragments. "Stuck, can't breathe, please hurry." Edward rose from the water without meeting her eyes. "I have to go," he said, already pulling on his coat. Sophie followed him out into the blizzard, the snow biting her skin. "Edward, it's dangerous, we're miles from anywhere," she called. But he didn't stop. The last thing she saw was his figure disappearing into the white, leaving her in the storm, 150 kilometers from home. She stood in the snow, shivering, her heart breaking in the silence of the mountains. Somewhere in that blizzard, a part of Sophie's love froze solid, and would never thaw again. 2 days later, Sophie finally made it back to London. The train ride felt endless, each station name blurring into the next, her thoughts circling the image of Edward walking away into the storm. When she stepped through the front door of their townhouse in Kensington, the air felt wrong. Too warm, too alive. She froze in the hallway. Voices drifted from the living room, Edward's low, reassuring tone, and another voice. A woman's voice. Amelia's. Moving silently, Sophie stepped forward. The sight stopped her cold. Amelia sat curled on their sofa, wrapped in one of Sophie's cashmere throws. Her blonde hair spilled over the cushions, and Edward was crouched beside her, holding a steaming cup of tea. His hand brushed her cheek in a way Sophie recognized all too well. Without thinking, Sophie reached for her phone. The camera shutter clicked softly. One photograph. Proof. Her finger hovered over the screen, ready to take another, until Edward's head turned. Their eyes met. He stood quickly. "Sophie, it's not what it looks like," he said, moving toward her. "Then tell me what it is," she replied, her voice shaking. Edward's expression shifted, softening into something almost pleading. "Delete it," he said quietly. Amelia's eyes darted between them, wide, almost fearful. Sophie's pulse thundered in her ears. She could keep the photograph. She could walk out and end it all right there. But Edward's gaze, that strange mixture of guilt and control, pinned her in place. Slowly, she tapped delete. The image vanished, leaving only a hollow ache in its place. For the rest of that evening, Edward acted as if nothing had happened. He poured Sophie wine, asked about her journey, even laughed at a small joke she made. But every word tasted bitter to her. Later, alone in their bedroom, Sophie stared at the dark ceiling. She realized something quietly devastating. She hadn't lost proof. She had lost the will to fight for something already gone. Winter in London has a way of making the city feel both intimate and vast. The streets were lit with golden fairy lights, the air thick with the smell of roasted chestnuts. Sophie had been invited, or perhaps instructed, by Edward to join him at a formal dinner in Mayfair. He said it was for business. She didn't believe him. The restaurant was the kind that seemed to hush the moment you stepped inside. Heavy velvet curtains, crystal chandeliers, and waiters who moved like shadows. Sophie spotted Edward immediately. He wasn't alone. Amelia sat beside him, dressed in a silk gown the color of midnight. They were deep in conversation, leaning toward each other, their hands almost touching on the white linen tablecloth. Edward looked up as Sophie approached. "You made it," he said, standing to kiss her cheek, a polite, distant greeting. He introduced her to a small circle of guests, his voice smooth and charming, but his eyes kept drifting back to Amelia. Throughout the meal, Sophie watched the tiny, telling gestures. Edward cutting Amelia's steak and placing the bite gently on her plate. The way he poured her wine before anyone else's. The quiet laugh they shared over something Sophie wasn't privy to. It was as if the rest of the table, and Sophie herself, didn't exist. Then came the turning point. A small dessert, almond tart with a delicate glaze, was placed before Amelia. She took a bite, and within seconds, her hand flew to her throat. Edward was on his feet instantly, his chair clattering back. "She's allergic," he shouted, waving for help. The room became a blur of movement. A waiter rushed over, a guest called for an ambulance. Sophie remained seated, her hands in her lap, her gaze fixed on Edward as he cradled Amelia's head, whispering words only she could hear. When they left for the hospital, Edward barely glanced at Sophie. She stayed behind, surrounded by murmurs and clinking cutlery, as if nothing had happened. The almond tart sat untouched in front of her, its sweetness now tasting of betrayal. The next morning, the winter sun crept weakly through the tall windows of their bedroom in Kensington. Sophie woke to an empty space beside her. Edward's side of the bed was still warm, the sheets crumpled. She followed the faint sound of running water to the ensuite bathroom. The door was slightly ajar. Edward stood in front of the mirror, shirtless, running a razor across his jaw. His hair was damp from a shower, his expression calm, almost too calm. Then Sophie saw it. A faint bruise just above his collarbone, its edges tinged with purple and red, unmistakable. A mark that didn't belong to her. Her breath caught, and the silence between them became deafening. Edward noticed her reflection in the mirror and paused mid-shave. "You're up early," he said lightly, as though nothing were wrong. Sophie stepped closer, her eyes fixed on the mark. "Where did you get that?" Edward glanced down briefly before shrugging. "It's nothing." Bumped into a shelf in the office. The lie was so casual it made her skin prickle. "A shelf doesn't leave teeth marks," she replied, her voice low. For a fraction of a second, his jaw tightened, but then he smiled, that same disarming smile he used on strangers, on Amelia, on anyone he wanted to bend. "You're imagining things, Sophie. We've both been under stress." He rinsed his face, patted it dry, and walked past her without another word. The faint scent of his cologne lingered in the air, mingling with something sharper, perfume that wasn't hers. Standing alone in the bathroom, Sophie stared at her own reflection. She barely recognized the woman looking back. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes colder than she remembered. The doubt had been gnawing at her for weeks, but this was no longer doubt. It was a wound. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of damp, grey day that seemed to swallow all colour from London. Edward had left early, saying he had meetings in the city. Sophie stayed behind, tidying the flat. While clearing Edward's desk, she noticed an envelope tucked beneath a stack of old travel brochures. It wasn't sealed. Her name wasn't on it. The handwriting on the front, elegant, looping, was distinctly feminine. She hesitated, her fingertips resting on the paper. For a moment, she told herself to put it back. But the weight of the past few weeks pressed against her resolve, and curiosity, or perhaps self-preservation, took over. Inside was a single sheet of cream stationery, scented faintly with something floral. The words were written in blue ink, each one deliberate. Edward, I can't stop thinking about that night in Bath. I know you said we should be careful, but every moment we're apart feels like a waste of life. The way you looked at me, I still feel it in my skin. I'll be in Snowdonia next week. I hope you'll come. Yours, always, Amelia. The room seemed to tilt. Sophie read the letter twice, 3 times, as if repetition would somehow change its meaning. But the sentences remained the same, burning into her mind. Her chest felt tight, her throat dry. She slid the letter back into the envelope and returned it to its hiding place, though the gesture felt absurd, as if pretending not to know could undo what she had learned. Later that evening, Edward returned, his tie slightly loosened, his voice warm as he asked about her day. Sophie answered quietly, watching his every movement. The way he poured himself a drink, the way he avoided her eyes for just a fraction too long. That night, as they lay in bed, she stared into the darkness, the words from the letter echoing in her head. Every moment we're apart feels like a waste of life. It was no longer a suspicion. It was a confession, written in ink. The mountains of Snowdonia were shrouded in white, the air sharp enough to sting the lungs. Sophie and Edward had driven up for what he called a change of scenery, though the idea had felt odd and rushed. He insisted it would be a short winter getaway before work consumed them again. By the time they arrived, snow was falling in heavy, slanting sheets, blurring the road ahead. They checked into a small lodge near the edge of the national park, its wooden beams creaking under the weight of ice. The fire crackled in the lounge, but the warmth did nothing to thaw the tension between them. The next morning, Edward suggested they take a short drive into the mountains. Sophie hesitated, the forecast had warned of worsening weather, but his tone was impatient, almost clipped. Against her better judgment, she agreed. The storm gathered quickly. Snow swirled across the windscreen, the wipers barely keeping pace. Somewhere along a winding road, Edward slowed the car and pulled over. The wind howled, shaking the vehicle. I need to go help a friend nearby, he said suddenly. Sophie frowned. A friend? Out here? In this weather? She needs me, he replied, eyes fixed straight ahead. And then she knew. Amelia. Edward stepped out, the wind snatching at his coat, snow already collecting in his hair. He didn't look back. Sophie sat frozen, her fingers gripping the steering wheel though the engine had gone silent. An hour passed. Then 2. The snow piled higher, erasing the edges of the road. Her phone had no signal. The cold crept in through her boots, into her bones. She realized he wasn't coming back, not now, maybe not at all. In the distance, a single set of headlights appeared, cutting through the white. A local farmer stopped, shocked to find her stranded. He offered to drive her back to the lodge, his small truck skidding along the icy road. Through the blur of frost on the window, Sophie stared into the darkness, her mind replaying the moment Edward's figure disappeared into the storm. A week had passed since Snowdonia, though the cold inside Sophie felt deeper than the snow that had surrounded her. Edward had returned 2 days later, offering no real explanation. He spoke of a business contact who had been in trouble, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of guilt every time she looked at him. Sophie didn't challenge him. Not yet. One Friday evening, Edward suggested they go into the West End for dinner. It had been months since they'd been out together, and part of her wanted to see if any trace of their old selves remained. Leicester Square was alive with the winter lights, the air rich with the scent of roasted chestnuts and street performers' music drifting through the crowd. They walked side by side, though their hands never touched. As they crossed towards the theatre district, Sophie's gaze caught on a figure just ahead. A woman in a deep red coat, her hair pinned in soft curls. She turned, laughing at something said by the man beside her, and Sophie's breath caught. It was Edward. Or rather, another Edward. Her Edward, standing there in the cold London air, holding Amelia's gloved hand as if it belonged there. The man beside her was not a stranger. He was the one who had been walking with Sophie seconds ago. She blinked, confused, but then reality crystallized. Edward had let go of her hand in the crowd, drifted ahead, and now here he was, with Amelia, smiling as though the past weeks had been nothing but a lie. The noise of the street faded to a low hum. Sophie stood frozen as Edward leaned in to say something to Amelia, his lips close to her ear, his palm resting on her back. A group of tourists passed, blocking Sophie's view for a moment. When they moved on, Edward and Amelia were already walking away together, disappearing into the press of people under the neon lights. Sophie felt the rush of blood in her ears, her legs unsteady. She turned towards the alley at the side of the theatre, leaning against the cold brick wall, her breath clouding in the air. The betrayal wasn't whispered now. It was displayed in the heart of London, under the lights, for the world to see. The days after Leicester Square blurred into one long stretch of silence. Edward acted as though nothing had happened, as though Sophie's eyes hadn't caught the truth in the middle of the city. He still came home late, still claimed endless meetings and urgent calls. Sophie, however, had stopped asking. Her questions had become answers in themselves. One cold Sunday morning, she stood by the window of their flat, watching the grey London drizzle streak the glass. Edward was in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone. She caught the way his thumb lingered over a message, the faint smile at the corner of his lips. It was enough. She turned away, walking quietly to the bedroom. From under the bed, she pulled out a suitcase. The sound of the zip made Edward look up. Going somewhere? He asked, a trace of amusement in his voice. Yes, she said simply, her voice steady. Home. He frowned. This is your home. Sophie met his eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she felt no tremor in her chest. Not anymore. The drizzle outside thickened into rain. She packed with deliberate slowness, not rushing, not hiding. Every folded jumper, every zipped pocket, was a quiet declaration. Edward didn't try to stop her. He leaned against the door frame, his expression unreadable, as if calculating whether it was worth speaking. When she was done, Sophie took her coat from the rack and stepped into the hall. She didn't look back. The click of the door closing behind her sounded final, like a lock turning. The rain followed her onto the street, washing the last traces of warmth from her skin. But as she walked towards the station, the weight she had carried for months began to lift, replaced by something unfamiliar yet certain. Freedom.